And now, to continue in this magnificent vein, I would like to introduce Susan Hawthorne. Over to you, Susan.
Truly fabulous to be part of this panel, and I'm really delighted to be here and speaking from Jiru country in far north Queensland. I grew up on Wiradjuri country in 1950s rural Australia on 2 farms in the Riverina. I joined the women's liberation movement in 1973 and came out as a lesbian in 1974. I volunteered really quickly at Melbourne Rape Crisis Centre and the Women's Liberation Centre, and also for a time at Halfway House. After attending Teachers College, I eventually got to La Trobe University, where I studied philosophy, history and zoology. Philosophy became my main subject, but I studied in history wonderful subjects called revolutionary history, Mexico, Russia and China, African history. There I was especially interested in the Igbo women of Nigeria, who raised a war called the Women's War in 1929 using pots and pans. And women's history, British and Australian, and especially around issues of suffrage. My first public writing activism as a feminist was putting up graffiti. There was a cigarette called Bradfield, which had the line "not mild," and groups of us went around Melbourne adding "but sexist" underneath it. And the night that a group of us went out, we only found one place that hadn't already been graffitied. So that was a rather wonderful entry into activism. Back at university doing philosophy, I decided to write a thesis on In Defence of Separatism, an analysis of power, oppression, domination and institutions, and of things peculiar to women's oppression: heterosexuality as an institution, rape as an instance of coercive power, and romantic love as yet another instance of power. And I ended with sections of on strategies on separatism and lesbian feminism. While I was punished by the philosophy department, I won't go into that, this analysis has stood me in good stead for understanding the world. I left Australia in late 1976, went to London, and in a squat heard about matriarchies. So I then took off to Greece and there became really enamored of the history and mythology of Greece. After I returned, I came back, started to learn modern Greek and then ancient Greek. In that time, I wrote yet another thesis, which was once again frowned upon because I talked about power and how it operates in the Homeric hymns to Aphrodite and Demeter. These might not seem like radical things, but actually I was really pushing the boundaries. In Defence of Separatism was finally fully published in 2019, and half of my other thesis was published in 2018. So it took a long time for things to change. I then spent the next years in a series of short-term jobs teaching Aboriginal students, teaching English to Arabic women, speaking women, working with unemployed youth, and eventually deciding that I wanted to be a writer. I gave myself 3 months to have something published and had my first work of fiction, and then started writing for the ABC, for Julie Copeland's first edition program, which was wonderful to do that, and also in the metropolitan newspapers. Now, the other thing that happened was I became unemployed for a very long time. I think it was 15 months. And that opened up a chance for me. I became the writing, theatre and music coordinator of Women 150 New Moods Festival. This was meant to celebrate 150 years of white occupation, and I tried to work against that as much as possible. Along with others, I organised a 9-day Language of Difference Writers' Week, and Kerry Hume and Audre Lorde were the keynote speakers. And there were whole days on Aboriginal, migrant, working class and lesbian writing, and in between writing workshops, book launches. Writers' festivals these days congratulate themselves on diversity, but they forget to mention that all these decades ago, we radical feminists were already doing it. As the theatre coordinator, I brought Eva Johnson's Ginderella to Melbourne, a play about Aboriginal dispossession in South Australia. And as the music coordinator, the first ever concert of all women's compositions with a woman conductor was held at the Melbourne Town Hall. So after that, I was exhausted and I took off to Greece again and via Moscow for 3 months. This time I was able to get by a little with my Greek, sitting at bus stops, mostly speaking ancient Greek to old women. I had a fabulous time spending a long time in Crete, but also getting to see Santorini. But again, you know, these were things that I was doing and then going off and turning it into other things later. A whole lot of things I now do would not have been possible without these crazy things. On my return, I got a job at Deakin University teaching Aboriginal students who were training to be teachers. Now, wonderfully, I met Renée Klein at the end of that year because she was also teaching. She had just arrived at Deakin. I had been applying for editing jobs throughout that year, and at the end, I landed a job as editor at Penguin. Here I was able to, as Valerie Solanas says, unwork the system. I tried hard to get books published by Aboriginal writers, by migrants and lesbians, and anybody I thought was subverting the system. One of the things that I did during that time is I managed to persuade Penguin and then later Random House to distribute the Feminist Book Fortnight Favourites catalogue. That was called the FBF, and it was a 2-week national festival for writers and readers, which we said from Burnie to Broome, which 4 of us ran in 1989 and in 91. And those involved were Julie Goff, Jocelynne, Scutt, Renée and me. And in each year we employed an organiser with funding from various state bodies. So if you can use state money to do radical feminist things, it's great. I stayed at Penguin for 4 years and worked with some fabulous writers like Dale Spender, Andrea Goldsmith, Finola Moorhead, Ruby Langford, and many, many more. In the summer of 91, Renée and I had a holiday at Kakadu, and there we talked about setting up Spinifex. We'd spent 1990 in the US, where Renée had a position as a distinguished visiting professor at San Diego State University teaching women's studies, and so Spinifex came into being. In 1994, another group of us put on the 6th International Feminist Book Fair, which we had to make a bid for in 1992. It was a huge undertaking, but in the end, a great success, with around 350 writers from literally all around the world, from China and Saudi Arabia and the US and Canada and New Zealand and everywhere, Germany, and about 100 publishers, also coming from places like Namibia and Egypt. So Spinifex Press has now been running for 31 years, and really it's my main form of activism these days. We've published around 300 books, and if you count the over 40 anthologies, thousands of writers. We've published writers from every continent, and we intentionally publish Indigenous writers, writers with a disability, working class writers, bilingual books, and much, much more. We're probably the publisher with the most lesbians in our list, but in fact, heterosexual women still outnumber lesbians. We're also one of the very few publishers with a strong list of books critical of transgenderism. So I'm just going to mention what they are so that you know. The End of Patriarchy by Robert Jensen, Transgender Body Politics by Heather Brunskill Evans, my book Vortex, The Crisis of Patriarchy, Detransition, Beyond, Before and After by Max Robinson, Doublethink, the Feminist Challenge to Transgenderism by Janice Raymond. Later this year, we have Penile Imperialism by Sheila Jeffries, On the Meaning of Sex by Kaiser Eckes Ekman, and Out of the Fog by Renée Gerlich. The anthology Not Dead Yet, which Renata and I edited last year, includes many essays critical of the trans ideology. We did not suggest that writers write on that, but a vast number of them did. It's a book by women who are over 70 years of age and is intended to break barriers between the feminist generations. It's a real joy to put work out there in so many important areas. For example, this month we're publishing Africa's Eden by Cheryl Adam, which will be launched as part of a trilogy spanning the 1940s to the late 1960s, and will be launched by Andrea Goldsmith on the 6th of April. And next month we publish Rose Hunter's Body Shell Girl, a memoir in a series of poems about getting into and out of the sex industry. It is powerful writing, and I could talk for hours about our books. I will also just mention that Zelda Deprano's book, Zelda, we republished in 1995, and this year sometime, Dan Andrews announced that there's going to be a statue of Zelda. I was also a member of two circuses in Melbourne, the Women's Circus and the Performing Older Women's Circus, which had to be over 40 to join. I became an aerialist, probably thanks to a childhood of climbing trees, hanging from the bars in the wool shed and the wheat bins. I'd always loved gymnastics, but was really only about a medium level. But it gave me the chance of doing solo shows where I later started to combine poetry and aerials. And I did a show at the Gay Games and at Byron Bay Writers Festival in 2002. In 1993, Renata and I travelled to Bangladesh for a conference organised by Farida Akhtar on people's perspectives on population. There were 65 women at the conference, and there I was in a group which was led by Maria Mies. I wrote a 3-page manifesto after 5 days with the conference, which Maria and Jenna Correa said I should turn into a book. And so I became interested in economics, globalization, and many other things I'd never been interested in before, including things like free trade agreements. It eventually turned into my PhD, Wild Politics, Feminism, Globalization, Biodiversity, and Women's Studies and Political Science. So it was quite something to do that after being pushed out by academia. But by now I was not particularly keen to be in academia, although I have now taught creative writing for about 20 years. I really love learning languages, though English remains the only language I speak fluently. I studied ancient Greek, Sanskrit, Latin, Walpurgis, French, German, and Italian. My German is mostly kept up by going to the Frankfurt Book Fair, but I haven't gone for the last 2 years, so it's fallen down. So the other constant is writing, and I have to say that Renata is my first and harshest critic, whether it's poetry, fiction, or non-fiction. She can get away with saying things like, "It's a bit boring," which makes me rethink the structure, as I did with my poetry collection, Lupa and Lamb. But I've also had overseas residencies where I wrote several of my books, and I began writing Vortex in Turkey. They've been great experiences. And when I think about it, actually, there's a lot of travel in my writing, and it comes out in books. So, and occasionally we head off and go camping so that we can get away from the connection, the forever connection. And it really is the best thing to do. The other thing that keeps me sane is dogs. And I think many feminists, many of us on this panel have dogs and cats in our lives. And of course, her major job is to remind me when it's time for a walk or when it's dinner time. And of course, I can't underestimate the powerful impact that Renata Klein has had on my life. We've lived together, worked together, laughed together, cried together, especially when our dogs have died. And all these experiences expand out into something profound to do with lesbian existence. to fighting for women to be themselves, to create the world in a different way. So looking back, in 1973, there was so much I didn't know about violence against women, about history and the history and culture of women, about rape and consciousness raising. But we simply jumped in and began doing things, even when we had no idea. So the laws on rape, for example, rape in marriage, would not change until 1982 in New South Wales, followed by changes in other states between 1985 and 92. If we had not had rape crisis centres and activism against rape, including Anzac Day marches against women raped in war, could any of this have changed? Laws on violence against women in the home are moving at a glacial pace, but how much more slowly would it have moved without feminists, especially radical feminists? That these were key issues for women is shown in me writing specifically about both issues in 1976 in Defence of Separatism. I could also not have worked in publishing if I hadn't first been unemployed and then working to organise festivals of women's writing. You never really know how what you do will expand out and take you into new directions. So jumping in is the critical thing. Transgenderism is a key area of activism where every heart and mind is needed. It will take time, but with persistence, passion, and a clear head, I'm sure we'll be able to change things. The Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights is a fantastic document, perhaps the first radical feminist declaration since 1989, when Finrage produced the Camilla Declaration. And the Women's Declaration International's regular presentations and discussions are inspiring, of which this is one. And I'm spurred on by so many amazing radical feminist online sources, articles, Zooms, real-life conferences, protests, and activism. And I think there's more going on now than there has been for a long time. On the downside, it's incredible that the Australian Human Rights Commission can take seriously a complaint by a man about not being able to get onto the female-only app Giggle, to the extent that founder Sal Grover is being pushed into taking it to the High Court. But when a man wanted to join the women's circus back in 2000, it was also taken seriously and divided the circus and destroyed much of the goodwill. I write about this in Vortex. But radical feminism has enriched my life enormously. Indeed, I think it saved my life. Deciding to be a lesbian is also the best decision I ever made. I'm not sure where my life would have headed without both those movements coming along when they did. Thank you very much.